For starters, Gus, if you could tell me a little bit about why you and your colleagues became interested in this particular topic.
This topic, prosocial behaviors and prosocial development, it's all about understanding what are the factors that predict people's kindness towards others, generosity, sharing, donating, all kinds of, volunteerism, all kinds of things that most of us desire to see in other people, things that really help to make our communities that much easier to live in, more desirable to live in. And these are things that ultimately foster cooperation and harmony in our communities and across societies. So it's a very important topic, I think, and it's a topic that actually has garnered some attention in the past, but often when it garnered the attention, it was always sort of relegated to the study of these kinds of behaviors in non-minority, non-ethnic, racial minority groups. And so a lot of the inclination for conducting research on this topic really evolved from the desire to understand how these positive qualities and behaviors are manifested in ethnic and racial minority groups and groups that traditionally have been stigmatized by our society.
What are some of these ethnic groups that you looked at for this prosocial behavior, and how did you and your colleagues go about measuring this?
We've done a variety of studies across different culturally diverse populations. Some of our research is cross-cultural research. It's conducted in other countries around the world. And then some of our research has focused on, within the U.S., particularly U.S. Latino, Latina populations, children and adolescents, and their families. And, it's a matter of discovering what are some of the, asking Latino parents, what are some of the kinds of behaviors, prosocial behaviors, that their kids engage in, and then developing measures, standardized instruments that we can then administer on a larger scale to test and examine models that would help us understand how these behaviors actually develop over time, and particularly in Latino populations.
Is there a recent study that you can point to?
So yes, there's been a few recent studies, and just to give you an example, in one recent study we were looking at the impact of exposure to economic stress in the family and how that impacts Latino and Latina adolescents' empathic responding, their ability to feel sorry for others and to feel concern for the situation of others, and then in turn how this empathic concern predicts 6 different types of prosocial behaviors. And so in a lot of our research, we've actually tried to not just think of prosocial behaviors as this sort of global, unidimensional idea, but rather understand that different kinds of prosocial behaviors may require different skills and capacities and dispositions. As I mentioned before, I alluded to a number of different kinds of prosocial behaviors, And each one of those kinds of prosocial behaviors may be actions that some individuals feel more comfortable engaging in, and others may feel less comfortable engaging in those forms of behaviors. And so it really only makes sense that we think about prosocial behaviors in a much more nuanced manner, in a manner that is a little more sophisticated, which then allows us to better predict these specific forms of prosocial behaviors.
When you're saying prosocial behavior, what kind of behaviors are you talking about?
These are sharing behaviors, these are donating behaviors, these are volunteerism. These are, again, everyday sorts of actions that sometimes we benefit. Other people do nice things for us, and sometimes we feel like doing something nice for someone else. And but within those different kinds of behaviors, we also understand that there are different underlying motives for engaging in some of these behaviors. Sometimes we do things for other people's, and even though it may seem like we're doing it for their benefit, in actuality it could be for our own selfish gains. So to give you a concrete example, sometimes we might help somebody, but really it's because we want to gain their trust, and then actually may even want to take advantage of them later on, right? Or we may engage in something that is very nice, that someone benefits, but really it's only under circumstances where it makes us look good in front of others, right? So we want to enhance our own social standing in the group, or make ourselves look better by making ourselves look prosocial, right? On the other side of it, there's also what many of us are very interested in, what we call altruistic behaviors. And these are behaviors that really primarily intended to benefit others. It's behaviors that really it's hard to argue that there is any sort of selfish gain from helping somebody do these sorts of things. The things that oftentimes come first to mind are heroic acts, acts of heroism and sacrifice, right? Where somebody may actually put themselves at risk to save the life of someone else, right? But it doesn't necessarily involve that kind of extreme altruistic behavior. It could be something more along the lines of an individual who commits themselves to engaging in charity work for a lifetime, for decades, going to a local food bank or working with homeless people in the street, and sure, it's possible that they may gain something from it, but really it's the kind of thing that's voluntary, and not a lot of other people would probably engage in that kind of behavior.
Are there certain kinds of parenting actions, behaviors, parenting styles that predict whether a child will have this kind of prosocial behavior or prosocial attitude?
We've been able to learn quite a bit about some of these parenting practices that are, work better than others. So for example, in general, we know that parents who are warm and supportive and responsive to their children, supportive of their adolescents and all that those parents tend to have kids who are more prosocial in general. So, and part of that is because it fosters empathy in their children. Having a warm, nurturing parent is good for promoting sensitivity, emotional sensitivity in their children towards other people. So it's good practice, it's good exposure for children. But there are other things that parents do, and sometimes I think they do these things even without their explicit intent to do so. Maybe they learned it from their parents, or they, picked it up from observing others. But so, for example, when a kid does something good, it's not uncommon for some parents to reward their child either with some sort of material gift, right? They might take them out for ice cream, or they might give them some extra privilege, or you know, or get them a gift of some kind, of something that, you know, that they wanted. Or sometimes parents will give them what we call social rewards, which they just will praise them for having done something good, right? And it's all meant to reinforce these prosocial behaviors towards others, right? And what we know is that in general, when parents use the material rewards, it seems to actually undermine, in the long run, it seems to undermine prosocial behaviors in kids. Because, in part because what these kids learn is that being prosocial is something that one maybe should be more inclined to do when they expect to get some kind of material reward for doing so. So there's this sort of expectancy that gets created whereby it seems to really function in a way that that undermines spontaneous acts of prosociality, right? On the other hand, when parents use social rewards, that seems to be much more effective in fostering prosocial behaviors, but also fostering altruistic forms of prosocial behaviors.
Is there a cultural difference? Did you, in your research, see a difference between the way parents behaved, their parental behavior here in the United States, as opposed to, I believe you said, other countries?
Well, we've done studies in Turkey and many other countries, and some of these other countries are different, quite distinct from the U.S., because some of these countries are more group-oriented, they're more oriented towards the family unit, they're more oriented towards the larger group, their community, and so forth. And that orientation, which is a cultural value, seems to facilitate certain kinds of prosocial behaviors more than others. And so one very important form of prosocial behavior that it facilitates, that we find more often in that kids do in some of these other countries than in the U.S., is helping towards family members. So helping relatives, right? And this is also associated with a strong cultural value of what we call familism. So this sort of strong endorsement of the importance of the family, that you know, that you are a member of the family, and as such, there are certain obligations, there's a certain commitment to help the family and better the family, and not just think about yourself. So that's one form of prosocial behavior that we see that's directed towards a specific target group.
Is there a best practice?
Authoritative practices and parenting styles is really the combination of parents who are very supportive of their children, and they are moderately demanding. So they don't overly control their children, but they're not permissive parents, right? They don't under control. So it's this sort of ideal, in a way, of, you know, high level of warmth and affection and love, expression of love towards your child, combined with this sort of firmness and demandingness that is optimal. And yes, there is a body of evidence that suggests that that style of parenting does foster prosocial behaviors in kids. But you know, there's some interesting other research that suggests that that the parenting styles is not sufficient to explain how parents really foster prosocial behaviors in kids from other cultural groups, from ethnic minority and racial minority groups.
Are there suggestions you can give to parents about their parenting styles that can foster these kind of behaviors?
There are some things that we can offer that we know based on evidence. I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that being responsive and warm, showing affection, towards your child is very important, and and being an involved parent is very important. One of the challenges with knowing what to tell parents is that, for example, with the authoritative parenting, even though it's the research shows that it's an ideal form for fostering prosocial behaviors, one big question that I always get asked by parents is, how do you know if it's enough, right? Like, at what level is too much or too little control, for example? That's really hard to gauge, and it may vary depending on the temperament of your child, right? If you have a very difficult child with a difficult temperament, then that child might require more control from the parents, right? If the child has an easier temperament, is calmer and not very reactive, or then perhaps the amount of control that you exert doesn't have to be as much, right? It also can vary depending on the conditions of the environment that the child is being raised in. It's very important. For example, we know that amongst Latino and African American parents who live in neighborhoods that might be unsafe, violent, high poverty communities, that's a very risky environment. And it may not be a luxury, or it may be a luxury for a parent under those circumstances to not exert control over their child, because their child could be put in a very dangerous situation. So it's not a very easy question to answer because of these sorts of things. But we are learning more and more about these sorts of conditions under which parenting can be more effective, under which the characteristics of the child is important to take into account, whereby some of these parenting practices can be more or less effective. And so, there's a number of things that just make it a much more difficult question to answer.
Can you give me an example of phrases that parents can use, or a way to start this conversation in such a way that it's warm and empathetic but still has that authoritative tone?
For example, in a circumstance where your child might have done something wrong, bad, or I think we know that there are ways of disciplining your child that is much more warm and much more positive and constructive. So, talking to them and taking the time to explain to them the reasons for why they're being disciplined, and why what they did was wrong, and how trying to get them to encourage them to put themselves in the shoes of the other child, or the other victim, or the person that may have been harmed or by whatever they did. Trying to get them to think about the feelings of that other child, or of the teacher, or and also in terms of reasoning and explaining and talking to them about these sorts of things, making sure that your child understands your moral values and your principles, and and why these things are important. So even if they may not have seen how what they did harms other people, maybe they cheated on a test or something like that, and so they may not have harmed someone, right? You can still talk to them about, the importance of being honest and fairness, right? And all these sorts of issues, and still try to get them to think about it, about how unfair it would be if other kids cheated and, took advantage of the situation, and sort of what the sort of long-term consequences of those kinds of actions would have for ourselves.
Is there a child's age range when this parenting works best?
It needs to be after toddlerhood, but you can start when they're in preschool, talking to them about these things. Your explanations need to be a little shorter. They need to be, as much as possible, give them some concrete examples, so that they can talk to them slowly about it. It does take effort, on the part of a parent, because you need to be patient, right? And as we know, sometimes kids, don't always pay attention, and you may have to do it again and say it again. I think sometimes it's helpful to, if possible, you can be firm with them, but also, insert some humor into the situation, or again, some expression of love, so that the child doesn't get the wrong message that somehow you love him or her less because of what they did, but that you really are there for them, to support them and to help them. Of course, the earlier you work with your kids on these sorts of issues, the better, because obviously it can get a little more difficult later on, especially if they haven't been really, if this is not something that you've expected of them, and then all of a sudden, you start, exerting your control and your demands on them, all of a sudden when they turn, 10 or 11 or 12. So the earlier the better to talk, take advantage of opportunities to talk about these sorts of things whenever you can. When you read stories to them, when you watch TV with them, or see a movie, or sometimes the kids will come back from school and tell you a story about something that happened, and, think about those moments as teaching moments, right? And windows of opportunity where you can help your child begin to build a sense of what is good, what is bad, what is moral, what is immoral. I mean, once the kids start talking, I think you can start talking to them. And you'd be surprised that sometimes that, very young kids, sometimes they will challenge you. They might even, ask you questions, but don't take it the wrong way. When they do that, that's really fantastic. That's a positive thing. That's something that you really want from them, because open communication with your child, no matter what age, is always a great thing.
Is there anything I didn't ask about this particular topic that you would want to make sure that people know?
One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that, as I said, this does take effort, and it does take practice, but it really is worthwhile. It can really, especially if you start early, it can really help to reduce and prevent problems later. And we all know that adolescence can be pretty challenging. But you really can do a lot of things early on that can help set the stage so that adolescence isn't too hard and too difficult.